cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, where more than 9,000 American soldiers are buried. First, General John Shalikashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, introduced retired Army Captain Joseph Dawson. Dawson led his men to do what at the time seemed impossible: break through the German defenses on the bluffs overlooking the beachhead.
He scrambled to the seawall, and years later, when he recalled his feelings as he assembled the survivors of the other boats, he said, "Utter chaos reigned, because the enemy controlled the field of fire so completely. There was nothing I could do on that beach except die." Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to introduce to you the then commanding officer of G Company, 16th Regiment, the Big Red One, winner of the Distinguished Service Cross for that action that day, a great American hero, Joseph T. Dawson.
Men rise above themselves to accomplish great things. Here on this hallowed ground is where the battle was joined. I cannot tell you what it means to me to stand on this spot where the path we took led us to where we are today. On behalf of all men and women who served their country in World War II, it is my special privilege and great honor to present the President of the United States.
In these last days of ceremonies, we have heard wonderful words of tribute. Now we come to this hallowed place that speaks more than anything else in silence. Here on this quiet plateau, on this small piece of American soil, we honor those who gave their lives for us 50 crowded years ago. Today, the beaches of Normandy are calm. If you walk these shores on a summer's day, all you might hear is the laughter of children playing on the sand, or the cry of seagulls overhead, or perhaps the ringing of a distant church bell. The simple sounds of freedom barely breaking the silence. Peaceful sounds. Ordinary sounds. But June 6, 1944 was the least ordinary day of the 20th century. On that chill dawn, these beaches echoed with the sounds of staccato gunfire, the roar of aircraft, the thunder of bombardment. And through the wind and the waves came the soldiers out of their landing craft and into the water, away from their youth and toward a savage place many of them would sadly never leave. During those first hours on bloody Omaha, nothing seemed to go right. Landing craft were ripped apart by mines and shells. Tanks sent to protect them had sunk, drowning their crews. Enemy fire raked the invaders as they stepped into chest-high water and waded past the floating bodies of their comrades. And as the stunned survivors of the first wave huddled behind a seawall, it seemed the invasion might fail. Hitler and his followers had bet on it. They were sure the Allied soldiers were soft, weakened by liberty and leisure, by the mingling of races and religion. They were sure their totalitarian youth had more discipline and zeal. But then something happened. Although many of the American troops found themselves without officers on unfamiliar ground, next to soldiers they didn't know. One by one, they got up. They inched forward, and together, in groups of 3s and 5s and 10s, the sons of democracy improvised and mounted their own attacks. At that exact moment, on these beaches, the forces of freedom turned the tide of the 20th century. These soldiers knew that staying put meant certain death, but they were also driven by the voice of free will and responsibility, nurtured in Sunday schools, town halls, and sandlot ball games. The voice that told them to stand up and move forward, saying, "You can do it, and if you don't, no one else will." And as Captain Joe Dawson led his company up this bluff, and as others followed his lead, they secured a foothold for freedom. Today, many of them are here among us. Oh, they may walk with a little less spring in their step, and their ranks are growing thinner. But let us never forget, when they were young, these men saved the world. And so let us now ask them, all the veterans of the Normandy campaign, to stand if they can and be recognized. Millions of our GIs did return home from that war to build up our nations and enjoy life's sweet pleasures. But on this field, there are 9,386 who did not. 33 pairs of brothers, a father and his son, 11 men from tiny Bedford, Virginia, and Corporal Frank Elliott, killed near these bluffs by a German shell on D-Day. They were the fathers we never knew, the uncles we never met, the friends who never returned, the heroes we can never repay. They gave us our world. And those simple sounds of freedom we hear today are their voices speaking to us across the years. Now the question falls to our generation. How will we build upon the sacrifice of D-Day's heroes? Like the soldiers of Omaha Beach, we cannot stand still. We cannot stay safe by doing so. Avoiding today's problems would be our own generation's appeasement. For just as freedom has a price, it also has a purpose, and its name is progress. Today, our mission is to expand freedom's reach farther, to tap the full potential of each of our own citizens, to strengthen our families, our faith, and our communities, to fight indifference and intolerance, to keep our nation strong, and to light the lives of those still dwelling in the darkness of undemocratic rule. Our parents did that and more. We must do nothing less. They struggled in war so that we might strive in peace. We know that progress is not inevitable, but neither was victory upon these beaches. Now as then, the inner voice tells us to stand up and move forward. Now as then, free people must choose.
Tens of thousands of American veterans of World War II have returned to France in the past few weeks, many to visit the cemeteries where their comrades are buried. These visits are often painful. So why do they come? Tom Bearden reports from Normandy.
They've been coming by the thousands to the American Military Cemetery above Omaha Beach. Tour buses full of veterans and their families. They don't stay in groups, though. Solitary figures roam the vast cemetery, searching out fallen comrades among the white tombstones that mark the graves of more than 9,000 American servicemen and women.
I want to look up a bunch of friends.
Of course.
Earl Brown was in the 1st Infantry Division. A lot of his buddies are here.
Jack Armstrong.
Okay, Armstrong.
Sergeant Bars, Lieutenant Crew, Kenny Davis, Noel Mock.
Noel Mock.
Yeah, Noel Mock, yeah. I know he was killed. He died next to me.
In the end, he could only find one grave.
20, 21.
Brown landed at Omaha Beach around noon on D-Day. He was wounded 4 times during the war.
25. 7. 28. 29.
Each time he came back from the hospital, more of his fellow soldiers had been killed. Soon, none of his original friends were left.
I think that in time, you do this. You forget it for a long time, and then for some reason when you get older, I think you begin to think about it more. You're sort of forced into it. I don't know what the gravitation is, but there's something there.
Something pulls you here?
Yeah, I think so. And you look at it and you think, why was I the survivor? How did I survive? We would get replacements, and sometimes we'd get 10 replacements. And in 3 days' time, there would be 2 of them left. And I don't know why. It wasn't because they did anything different or wrong. It wasn't battle experience, because if a shell went off, one here would get hit and the one over here wouldn't.
Random.
Random. It just, you know, it's like a lottery.
Does coming back here help you deal with those emotions?
Well, in a way, I think yes, because I come and I can pay my respect to them. And part of what they've done has made it possible for me to live.
Many of these men haven't thought much about the war since it ended. They've been plumbers and carpenters, businessmen and civil servants, fathers and grandfathers for the past 50 years. But despite a lifetime of other experiences, the memories of war are very close to the surface. Mike Cornuta flew a P-51 fighter escorting bombers over Germany, was shot down, spent the rest of the war as a POW. He says that his coming back to Normandy is like a horse returning to a burning barn.
The man will pull the horse out of the barn, and if he lets him go, the horse will run back into that barn. There's a similarity here. Why do we come back? For many of us, it's a flashback, which is not pleasant. And then I don't know what brings it on. All of a sudden, I'm right back there. I don't know if you watched at the laying of the reef. I had a heck of a time trying to control it. But if I hadn't controlled it, I probably wouldn't be able to talk to you now, because it is not pleasant. And yet, I come back possibly to see if it was worth it. But more important than that is, why was I spared? And these things go through your mind, and you often wonder why. So I'm back here. I still don't have the answer.
So why put yourself through this?
If I knew the answer, I'd be sitting at home.
It's been painful for Don Rusin, too. But returning to Normandy has also been a positive experience. Rusin's unit suffered heavy casualties on June 6, 1944, facing the stiffest resistance any Allied unit faced on D-Day. Rusin and other members of the 29th Infantry Division Association came to Omaha Beach to lay a wreath on the stone monument dedicated to that sacrifice. Rusin says the visits are as much for the dead as for the living.
They know we're remembering them.
Hey, Phil,
And
what's your range?
you know, I lost a brother during the war, and I don't stand around agonizing about that. Nothing will bring him back, but on the other hand, I think they like to know that we do remember them. So that's the part that I think makes it special and what makes it worthwhile for me to go through with it.
Rusin has gained not only peace of mind, he's also learned more about what actually happened on Omaha Beach from his fellow veterans.
So much happened that one person's very narrow foxhole view of it doesn't give you the big picture. So this is a chance for us to learn about that, too.
So in a sense, you're learning about the battle even 50 years later.
Oh, yeah, we're reliving history, and we're beginning to get a perspective that we never had then. Yep.
Sharing the experience seems essential. Veterans appear compelled to take every opportunity to compare their histories.
How far in did you go on the first? Where did you camp the first night?
And to teach their families.
Yeah, they were laying artillery in on us all the day before. We lost some guys there, dead and wounded.
Hello, Beatrice.
For some, the return to Normandy is a chance to remember the good times as well as the bad, and to renew old friendships. Madame Beatrice Bouvier-Muller has spent years to ensure that the Americans who fought here won't be forgotten. She's dedicated her life to putting up plaques at dozens of old airfield sites that have now reverted to pastures. Her friendship has brought former P-47 pilot Walter Grabowski back again and again.
This is my 4th year in 5 that I'm here.
Yes.
This is my second home.
Why do you come here?
They love us Americans here. The Normands here really, they peel over backwards for us. And I just respond. I just love these folks.
Is it the same kind of feeling that you had, a feeling of welcome that you had when you were here during the war?
Absolutely.
Oh,
and
yeah.
more so. And more so.
Yeah.
And more so.
Yeah.
Unlike many of the ground troops, the pilots stayed in the area long enough to become acquainted with the people who lived in the surrounding countryside. Pilot Gabriel Greenwood couldn't forget the 2 young French boys who lived with his fighter squadron 50 years ago. They had just escaped from a Nazi forced labor camp.
While we were here, one of them just walked into where our tent area was, and he was 17 years old, so we adopted him. We made little uniforms for him, and they worked for us, and we made them work in the mess hall. And then about a week later, the other fellow happened to be the brother, a year older, 18, came in. And so they traveled with us.
The pilots dubbed the brothers Pete and Repeat. This year, Greenwood brought a picture from his album and set out to find them.
Well, we talked to people about it, and I think they were asking around the town. And we were at this little restaurant right in the heart of Picoville. Who comes walking in but Repeat? And then he says, Pete's up here, and they came down. Big celebration. You know, Pete, and here they were, here they were. 67 years old, 68 years, they're still alive. I hadn't seen them for 50 years. There they were.
Finding old comrades is important. It helps those with gray hair remember the transcendental events of their youth and to recapture it.
I am gray-haired now, and they are gray-haired. That's all. But in their mind, and in my mind, and I believe that in many mind of French people, they are still young, as we were still young at this time.
For Greenwood, being here has helped him recapture the closeness of men in combat that was so important to surviving. It's also helped in coming to terms with the pain and has provided a measure of relief.
We depended on each other. And then when you get into a mess, went over the marching yards, whatever we were doing, whatever our target area was, whether we were dive bombing a marshalling yard or a dam or a bridge or what have you, everybody did it. Everybody knew what everybody else was doing all the time. And we watched each other's tail. When we went, once in a while we'd get bounced by Jerry, and everybody watched each other's tail and so on. Well, you see, that brings you in pretty close. Your life depends on the other fella, and his life depends on you. So that you get pretty close comradeship. When you're reminiscing, talking to somebody else, you only remember the good things. That's one thing. You think only of the good things. When you get up with your buddies, then you talk about the other things. What happened? For instance, here in our squadron, we lost 15 pilots. Just one squadron out of the 3. So those things you talk about when you're...
For every joy of reunion, for every Pete and Repeat rediscovered still alive after 50 years, there are dozens of losses, deaths that are freshly felt. These men who survive the ultimate test of courage and fear are often embarrassed that the tears are so close to the surface 50 years later.
Mark was a real man.
They hurt when they come to Normandy and the other battlefields, but they also seem quite unable to stay away.
In Germany, which was not invited to participate in the D-Day ceremonies, the day evoked varied emotions. Tanya Sillen of Independent Television News talked with people in Berlin.
In East Berlin, there's little left of the past except the memories of those who lived through it. Fred Delheim is a German and a veteran, but his war was against his own country, for he took part in the Allied invasion.
10 days ago, I went to Normandy. I was invited by French resistance people in preparation of D-Day. And when I was here on Marzahn station, a group of young people were shouting, or I would say singing, a song which I have heard 60 years ago during the Nazi time when I lived here. And they shouted or sang, "Und heute gehört uns Deutschland und morgen die ganze Welt." That means today the whole of Germany belongs to us, and tomorrow the whole of the world.
But senior German officers had different fears for their country. 50 years ago, Winrich Beer faced defeat at Normandy alongside his commanding officer, Field Marshal Rommel. German propaganda showed the invasion being repulsed, but those on the Western Front knew better.
I was convinced that the war was lost for the German side. And I feared that the attack of the Russians would come to Berlin or to my country earlier than the light Western side. I was preferring, if troops came in my country, that the Western troops would enter.
The war has little meaning to younger Germans. Today's generation identifies with the victory of the Allies and the cultural values of America. At times, the beaches of California seem closer than the beaches of Normandy, whatever the weather. This is their world, however it was inherited. School children I spoke to felt no connection to the Germany of Adolf Hitler.
I don't feel responsible for the Second World War because it was not my generation. I mean, it was Germany, but it was not the Germany which is now our Germany, in which we live in.
And there's concern among young people that their image abroad has been tainted by neo-Nazis.
I think it's wrong that they only show the bad side at the TV sets, at English news or American news, and they don't show both sides, only the bad side.
Today, German television broadcasts live from Normandy. But it's election year and politicians prefer to avoid the subject. It's said that most people here haven't heard of D-Day anyway. Those with any historical memory identify with the resistance. On the 20th of July, Germany will commemorate the attempted coup against Hitler and the execution on this spot of 4 army officers led by Klaus von Stauffenberg.
Innenpolitischen Bewusstsein der Deutschen steht allerdings, dass die Erinnerung an Stauffenberg.
In the political consciousness of Germans, there's the memory of Stauffenberg and his almost successful coup against Hitler. This is the central event in German political resistance.
In dem innenpolitischen Widerstand.
If confronting the past is difficult for many Germans, it's hard for most Berliners to avoid it. When the seat of government returns here in a few years' time, it'll be over half a century since a united Germany has been ruled democratically from the Reichstag. Liberation wasn't a reality here until the wall came down in 1989. Its most famous checkpoint is now a memento. And only now are Allied troops leaving Berlin. This weekend, the city threw a party to bid them farewell, and they even invited the Russians. Certainly, the end of Berlin's occupation has been easier to celebrate than the end of France's.
D-Day meant the victory of those who stood for freedom. And the Allied people here protected our peace and freedom, and now they can leave. That means we have reached the possibility, I don't say the reality because Europe has different events, but the possibility of living together in peace and freedom.
As night fell over Berlin, a specially commissioned song marked the end of the party.
Next tonight, economic crisis in Fidel Castro's Cuba. Castro's communist government is being tested as never before. Last week, it was forced to raise prices on some basic items in an effort to stabilize the economy. At the same time, there were several reports of hard-pressed Cubans seeking political asylum or trying to flee the country in boats. Correspondent Charles Krauss was in Cuba recently and has this report.
The Arias Maternity Hospital in Havana is as good a place as any to see the impact of Cuba's worsening economic crisis. On a wall at the hospital, there's the usual picture of Fidel Castro. But today, it seems he's peering down on what can only be described as the ruins of his socialist revolution. Not so long ago, seamstresses at the hospital would have had cloth to make surgical gowns and uniforms. These days, they hand-roll cotton swabs. And in another part of the hospital, they make sanitary napkins. In the pharmacy, there's no anesthetic or antibiotics for the expectant mothers, nor for their newborn children. Hospital administrators say they're determined to maintain basic care and sanitary conditions despite the many shortages. But they also acknowledge there's one alarming shortfall they can't do much about. Because of the economic crisis, fewer Cuban women want to have children. The number of babies born at the hospital has fallen over the past several years by more than 60%. Today, there are more abortions than there are live births. Education and healthcare were always considered the two great triumphs of the Cuban Revolution. But today, like almost everything else in Cuba, they too are suffering badly. Pedro Monreal is an economist. He supports Castro. But even Monreal says hunger and disease are beginning to tear apart the revolution's achievements and undermine support for the regime.
This is a very tough situation for common citizens in Cuba.
Has it ever been this bad before?
As far as I remember, not during the last 35 years.
How long do you think the government has to get the situation here under control and to begin to make some improvements? How long do you think it has before the people in this country are just going to say enough?
Well, it's difficult to forecast exactly about this. I would say that it's very difficult to maintain the current situation one more year if the economy is not improving. It will be very difficult.
Havana was once one of the most beautiful cities in the Western Hemisphere, and there are still traces of its Spanish colonial heritage. There are also traces of the 1940s and 50s, when Havana was a glamorous playground for wealthy Americans. In those days, the Riviera Hotel was owned by the mob, and the U.S. was by far Cuba's largest trading partner. American cars and other products were sold legally. But that was a long time ago, before the revolution. Today, much of Havana is falling apart. Once a building crumbles, the government has no money to buy paint, much less bricks and mortar. Gasoline and electricity are also in short supply. Bikes have replaced cars to save fuel. while most neighborhoods in Havana are blacked out 8 to 10 hours a day to save electricity. Many government restaurants, factories, and shops are open only because the government requires employees to report for work, even if there's nothing for them to do. No customers at this coffee shop in Havana, for example, because there's no coffee, sandwiches, or ice cream. But it's the shortage of basic food, rice and beans, that's now Cuba's most critical problem. At bodegas throughout the country, Cubans receive their monthly ration: 6 pounds of rice, some pasta, fish and chicken for the children, cigarettes, and a bottle of rum for adults. Despite the meager rations, there are Cubans who still support Castro and Cuba's socialist system. This man told us he remains a loyal member of the Communist Party.
The benefits are the healthcare system, the education of our children. They go to school free. Here we don't have to pay taxes. Here we don't have to pay rent for our homes. The healthcare system in this country is very concerned and will take care of this woman's baby. As you can see, she is pregnant, and the healthcare system will make sure that the baby is born healthy and without any problems. Fidel is a man who cares for children.
But for the first time since the revolution 35 years ago, many of the people we talked to said they and their children are going hungry. And it's that hunger that's turning more and more of them against the revolution.
In the middle of my life, instead of prospering, I'm going down and down. The more you work, the more you try, nothing. I don't have a car, no good life, no prospects, no clothing, no shoes. I can't afford medicine, no light, no electricity. I can't even invite a girlfriend on a date. No matter how hard you try, you can't make any money.
And there appears to be little relief in sight. The only bright spot on Cuba's economic horizon might be oil production along the north coast. But the quality of the oil is still in question. Otherwise, the government has been unable to increase Cuba's sugar and nickel exports enough to make up for the $6 billion a year in Soviet subsidies it lost 4 years ago. Adding to Cuba's problems, this year's sugar crop is expected to be one of the worst in memory, while food production also continues to plummet. To counter the growing anti-government sentiment and ultimately to keep himself in power, last year Castro reluctantly agreed to several economic changes. The reforms are all designed to bring in more dollars and improve Cuba's export prospects without fundamentally altering the basics of Cuba's socialist system. Tourism, for example. The Cuban government has actively sought foreign investment and European managers for its hotels in Havana and the beach resort at Veradero. As a result, an increasing number of mostly Canadian and German tourists are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year enjoying cheap package tours to communist Cuba. Another reform approved by Castro last year opened the way for some Cubans to work for themselves, mostly craftsmen and skilled workers. Lazaro Villa is a barber who now works at home, making more money in a day than he used to make in a month working at a state-owned barber shop. But he's worried about how long the self-employment law will last.
The problem is that the government passes laws, one law after the other. They introduce them, then you start operating under the law, and then they take it back. I'm talking here about the legalization of businesses like mine. People who are in business like me may end up in jail because the government decides to change its mind and make illegal what they had just made legal. So those of us who do this kind of work are constantly taking a risk.
Just recently, Castro seemed to confirm Villa's fears, appearing to back away from some of the reforms. He introduced a new law cracking down on black marketeers, people Castro called speculators. Another part of Castro's reform package makes it easier for Cuban exiles living in the U.S. and other countries to return to Cuba to visit their relatives. Since last fall, 2 to 3 charter flights a day have linked Miami to Havana. Cuban exiles now bring with them or send their relatives in Cuba an estimated $400 to $500 million a year, an important source of hard currency for the government. But to capture this hard currency, Castro had to make it legal for Cubans to hold dollars. The government also opened special dollar stores last year where average Cubans can spend their dollars on food and other goods they can't buy for pesos. Lines often stretch around the block, hungry and dirty. People wait to buy what they can just to survive. Lourdes Maceda, for example, waited half an hour to buy 6 bars of soap.
¿Qué ha comprado?
6 jabones.
¿Y por qué?
We've not had soap in 6 months, she told us. And what do you think of the economic situation, we asked? Depressing. Really, really depressing.
¿Quién es el culpable?
Ah, no, eso sí no sé.
And who's responsible? If I tell you, they'll cut out my tongue. Clearly, legalizing the dollar has made life a bit more tolerable for some Cubans. But dollarization has also proved to be a double-edged sword for Castro. That's because many of the revolution's die-hard supporters in the bureaucracy, the police, and the military don't have access to dollars. As a result, they're now much worse off than even some opponents of the regime who have relatives in Miami or who work in the tourist hotels.
Let me put a brief example. In Cuba, a bartender in any of these hotels could earn just on the base of tips in 1 week the same amount of money that the best physician in Cuba can obtain in 1 year. This is a huge distortion of relative wages in Cuba.
And what is that doing to the people's perceptions of the revolution and of the government?
Well, basically, this has been an unfair measure.
Unfair?
Unfair, yeah.
People are resentful.
I would say so.
Even though the crisis clearly began when the Soviet Union cut aid to Cuba in 1989, Castro has increasingly tried to blame his economic problems on the U.S. trade embargo, which was tightened 2 years ago. Today, there are billboards in front of the U.S. interest section in Havana denouncing the embargo, which prohibits American companies and even their foreign subsidiaries from doing business in Cuba.
Nación y migración.
As part of a continuing campaign to overturn the embargo, Castro recently invited more than 200 Cuban exiles from the U.S. and other countries to an elaborate conference in Havana. One of those who attended the conference was Alicia Torres. Her Washington-based Cuban-American committee lobbies Congress, arguing that the embargo, which was first imposed some 30 years ago, is part of a policy aimed at overthrowing Castro at an unacceptable price.
When you look at the people who are promoting the maintenance or even the strengthening of the U.S. embargo, you have to question whether or not creating that kind of chaos and conflict inside of Cuba, or what they call in Miami the pressure cooker theory, where you create so much pressure that the country explodes, you have to ask whether or not that is in the interest of the U.S. government, you know, whether a civil war 90 miles from our coast is in the interest of the U.S. society in general, and whether it's in the interest of Cuban Americans and their relatives here in Cuba.
But in Washington, Congressman Robert Torricelli says it's perfectly legitimate for the United States to use trade to try to influence respect for human and political rights in Cuba. It was Torricelli who sponsored